Hey everyone, and welcome back to Abyssin. In today's video, we're diving into 6 terrifying cave stories. And trust me, the last one is a tragic accident so disturbing, I think it's one of the scariest things you could ever imagine happening inside a cave. Deep in the heart of the Philippines, amid Bukidnon's wild and mountainous terrain, lies a place as stunning as it is dangerous. Local legends claim these landscapes guard the last remains of a forgotten fortune, Yamashita's gold. This legendary treasure, looted by the Japanese army during World War II, was supposedly buried in the Philippine mountains to keep it from falling into enemy hands. Over the decades, countless treasure hunters have been drawn to the myth, most returning empty-handed, nursing only bruises and broken tools. Others never made it back at all. On March 10th, 2024, a group of 8 men decided to confront the mystery head-on. They entered a cave located in Sitio Tinago, in the Cabangan area of Bukidnon. Their goal was clear: uncover the riches they believed were hidden underground. Among them were Bibo, Roni, John, and Doi, along with 4 other companions. Unlike clueless fortune seekers relying on rusty tools and blind faith, they thought they were well equipped for the task. They wore protective clothing and carried gear, but lacked one crucial thing: experience. None of them were trained cavers. None truly understood the risks that come with underground exploration. That Sunday, without proper technical knowledge or legal permits, they stepped into the cave with hope written all over their faces. As they descended, the air grew heavier. Their flashlights barely pierced more than a few feet ahead. Behind them, the cave's entrance faded into darkness. Excitement grew with every step forward. For weeks they had studied old maps, cross-referenced cryptic notes, and followed whispers of buried treasure. Everything pointed to that cave, secluded and forgotten, where, according to the stories, soldiers had once buried chests of gold. They were sure they had found the right place. They began digging right away. Time passed, and the only sounds were metal scraping against stone. The air was cold, yet sweat dripped down their faces. They took turns digging, going deeper with each minute. Then one of them hit something odd. A metallic clang echoed through the chamber. Not the muffled thud of soil or rock. It was different. Everyone froze. No one spoke. Hearts pounded. With trembling hands, they knelt and began clearing the dirt carefully. Inch by inch, something began to emerge. A corroded metal surface buried beneath the earth. 1,000 thoughts raced through their minds. They grabbed tools and tried to pry the box free from the hardened soil. That's when everything unraveled. A faint hissing came from the disturbed ground. At first, it was barely noticeable, a thin wisp of smoke rising slowly, but within seconds, more smoke started to pour out. Thick, dark, and pungent, it burned their throats. They stumbled backward, coughing, eyes watering. Panic set in. This wasn't just smoke. It was something toxic, and it wasn't stopping. They barely had time to react. The acrid stench spread fast, searing their nostrils, drying out their mouths. Their lungs began to fail. Vision blurred. In seconds, what had been a path to fortune turned into a death trap. Some scrambled to retreat, clutching their faces, gasping for air. Others dropped their tools, their limbs weakening, their movements sluggish. It was carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless, and deadly. But they didn't know that yet. Roni was the first to fall. He had been pushing ahead, eyes fixed on the exit, when his legs buckled. He hit the ground hard, coughing violently, hands gripping his throat as he struggled for air that wouldn't come. The smoke had grown too thick. Bibo stumbled just ahead, feeling along the wall for direction, but his strength was draining fast. Gasping for breath, he collapsed to one side, coughing uncontrollably, fingers twitching against the stone before going still. John and Doi weren't far behind, their shapes barely visible through the haze. John dropped to his knees, bracing himself with his hands, and vomited hard. He fought against the poisoned air, trying to crawl, but his body refused to cooperate. He collapsed face first onto the ground. Doi was the last. He nearly reached Bibo, almost managed to drag him back, but his legs froze. Dizziness hit, his chest ached, and his sight faded. He coughed so hard it sounded like tearing inside his chest. With a final shuddering breath, he slid down the cave wall. Just a few more feet, but it was too late. Outside, the other four stumbled into the daylight. They collapsed onto the rocky ground, coughing, vomiting, faces pale as ash. They gasped for breath, their chests heaving, bodies trembling in shock and exhaustion. Every inhale burned like their lungs were still fighting off the poison. They had made it out, barely. But four men were still inside. Ronnie, Bebo, John, and Doi remained trapped, surrounded by deadly smoke. News spread fast. That same night, emergency crews and local authorities arrived on site. But there was one major issue. No one could go in. The cave was filled with carbon monoxide, a silent killer. Not even trained rescuers were safe. The provincial disaster team assessed the situation. One mistake could mean more deaths. Wearing oxygen tanks, the rescue teams began their descent. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. They could feel the poison saturating the space. It took hours to reach the men. What they found was heartbreaking. The four lay motionless, their bodies frozen in the midst of escape attempts. Some had collapsed halfway through the chamber, arms stretched toward the exit. Others had fallen where they stood, drained of all energy. Their faces wore an eerie calm, as if they had fallen asleep before fear could fully take over. The bodies were removed with care, above ground. Grieving families wept. Officials stood in silence, helpless. The cave that had promised treasure had delivered only tragedy. Investigators tried to determine the cause of the gas leak. Some believed the men had triggered an old wartime trap designed to release poison on intruders. Others thought it was a natural carbon monoxide buildup, trapped underground for decades due to decomposing organic matter. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: devastating loss. The survivors were hospitalized with severe carbon monoxide poisoning. One of them, his voice barely audible, later said, "It happened so fast. One moment we were digging, the next everything went black." Authorities renewed their warnings. Illegal cave exploration is dangerous and forbidden. Chasing legends can lead to irreversible loss. Still, the myth of Yamashita's gold lives on, even after the deaths, some believe. Some claim the men found something before the gas claimed them, and some are already planning to return. The caves of Bukidnon remain untouched. The chamber where those men fell is now a place of silence, yet the same stories that brought them there continue to circulate. And somewhere, right now, others are getting ready to descend, convinced they'll succeed where so many failed. But the earth remembers, and it doesn't give up its secrets easily. October 7th, 2022 started off like any other day in the Black Hills of South Dakota. 3 cave explorers were preparing near an unmarked entrance to Mystic Cave, a little-known underground system on private land. Among them was a speleologist. His name wasn't mentioned in the article where I found the story, but he was described as tall, lean, and highly experienced, shaped by years of navigating tight passages and vertical climbs. He double-checked his helmet light, tested the batteries, and inspected his mapping gear. His companions, also seasoned in the field, carried lightweight packs with water, energy bars, and additional tools for surveying. Their objective that day was to explore and chart a newly opened path deep within the cave system. They entered Mystic Cave around 9 a.m. The beginning of the journey was relatively comfortable, with wide passages and enough headroom to walk upright. But that quickly changed. Before long, they were crawling through tight tunnels, their bodies pressed flat against the ground. After roughly 40 minutes, they reached what had previously been the farthest accessible point of the cave, a small chamber with a ceiling so low it forced them to stay hunched over. In one of the corners, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look, there was an opening marked by recent excavation. Previous trips had focused on widening this promising spot, slowly digging out a narrow passage just wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. Beyond that, it was uncharted territory. The most experienced of the group volunteered to go first. Despite his height, which posed an obvious challenge in such tight spaces, he had mastered the techniques needed to maneuver through places most would consider impassable. Calm and confident, he examined the hole with his headlamp, then removed his helmet and set it aside. The passage looked to be just about 9 to 10 inches high, with a sharp right turn only a few feet in. He laid down and began the slow, methodical process of entering the crevice. The cold rock pressed against his chest and back, draining his body heat almost instantly. There was no room to lift his head. The only way to see was by twisting his neck slightly, something that became uncomfortable very quickly. After moving forward nearly 6 feet, he encountered the first major obstacle, a 90-degree turn. Navigating it required careful coordination. Every inch forward meant his clothes scraped against the jagged rock, creating resistance he had to overcome with sheer physical force. Soon after that first turn, another appeared, this time bending the opposite direction, forming an S-shaped path that would become the real challenge of the day. Still, he kept pushing forward, contorting his body to fit the shape of the tunnel. The second curve was even tighter, but past it, the passage sloped upward unexpectedly into a tiny chamber where, at last, he could sit up. The small discovery brought momentary relief. It was a new segment of the cave and could prove valuable for mapping efforts. He took a deep breath, enjoying the brief freedom of movement before turning his thoughts to the return trip. He'd need to descend that sloped section headfirst and make his way back through the S-shaped passage, only this time in reverse. The trouble began the moment he positioned himself to exit. As he tried to move downward, he realized the approach from that angle was far worse. The natural bends his body had followed going in now worked against him. His legs, in particular, couldn't replicate the movements his arms and shoulders had performed earlier. After about 15 minutes of trying, the first real warning sign hit. He couldn't get his legs back through the second bend. He experimented with multiple positions, but nothing worked. Each failed attempt drained his energy and pushed his heart rate higher, making him breathe faster in the tight space. It felt as though the tunnel was closing in, even though he knew that wasn't physically possible. His companions, waiting in the small room just beyond the passage, soon realized something was wrong. They could barely reach his outstretched hands. They tried to pull while he pushed with his legs, but the angle of the tunnel worked against them. After an hour of futile efforts, the truth was clear. He was completely stuck, unable to move more than a foot in either direction. His position was excruciating. The cool temperature that once felt refreshing now threatened his health. Unable to move and pressed against the cold rock, hypothermia became a very real danger. After 2 hours, his teammates made a tough decision. They needed outside help. One of them stayed with him, while the other began the 40-minute journey back to the surface to call for rescue. You can imagine, spending hours in that position wasn't just physically painful, it was psychologically overwhelming. Time dragged endlessly. 4 hours after getting stuck, the first rescuers arrived. Local cave rescue specialists from the Paha Sapa Grotto team. They brought food, water, thermal packs, a communication line to the surface, and most importantly, tools to widen the tunnel. From the beginning, the rescue was an enormous challenge. Even the smallest rescuers could barely reach his head in one hand. The hammer drill, their primary tool, could only be used from awkward positions, limiting its effectiveness. Every tiny chunk of rock removed was a hard-won success, measured in inches. Noticing clear signs of worsening hypothermia, rescuers intensified their efforts. They sent in more thermal packs and covered whatever parts of his body they could reach with emergency blankets. All night long, they worked in shifts, drilling through solid rock. The sound was deafening in the tight space, and the stone dust irritated his eyes and lungs. But each fragment removed was progress. Around the 15-hour mark, they finally cleared enough room for him to bend his knees slightly, the first time he'd been able to change position in over half a day. That small shift gave him a renewed sense of hope. Close to 6 a.m. on October 8th, after 18 hours of being completely immobilized, the final push succeeded. As they pulled on the rescue straps, he felt his body slide through the newly widened bend. In the small chamber just past the point where he had been stuck, they wrapped him in thermal blankets and gave him warm fluids. Amazingly, he had no serious injuries. The journey back to the surface took twice the normal time. When he finally emerged into the morning light, He knew he'd never look at tight spaces the same way again. What used to be a technical challenge was now something he'd treat with deep and permanent respect. On July 18, 1980, David Carson and John Brock, both 19 years old, arrived at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. This park is one of the most impressive and mysterious national parks out there. With over 119 known caves, it's famous for its unique geology and stunning underground formations. Unlike most caves formed by water reacting with carbon dioxide, Carlsbad's caves were shaped by sulfuric acid. This acid came from underground water mixing with petroleum gases in the area. This unusual process created rare and amazing features like the gypsum candelabras found in Wachee Cave, which can be up to 20 feet long. David and John were natural adventurers, driven by a hunger to explore places few dared to step into. That afternoon, before heading into the park, they stopped at a nearby bar, pumped up and knocking back a few beers to fuel the adrenaline for their adventure. When they finally got to the visitor center, it was almost closing time, and most tourists were wrapping up their tours. But Carson and Brock had other ideas. They wanted more than the usual guided path. Their plan was to go beyond the official trails and see what lay in the uncharted dark corridors of the cave. As they approached the main entrance, they watched the last groups of tourists being told it was time to leave. Even with the sun setting and closing hours near, they kept walking down the main trail, heading deeper into the cave. They reached a large chamber called the theater room. There, a thick chain blocked the way forward with a clear sign reading, "No entry beyond this chain." For most people, that would be the final sign to turn back. But for Carson and Brock, it only fueled their excitement. The alcohol and their adventurous spirit took over. After making sure no one was around, they jumped over the chain and went on, leaving behind the lit paths and stepping into total darkness. As they went deeper, the silence and vastness of the underground space surrounded them. The temperature dropped, the air grew heavier, and an unexplainable tension filled the atmosphere. Carson led the way with a flashlight whose beam barely reached beyond a few feet in the pitch black. It was there, in that deep and eerie silence, that both started to feel the terror of the unknown, a world almost untouched by humans. The only sound was the faint crackling of their footsteps on the cave floor. They tried to stay cautious, but it was clear the booze was messing with their judgment. A few feet ahead, they came across a locked gate meant to keep people out of the dangerous parts of the cave. They stopped for a moment, weighing their options. For many, that gate would be the end of the journey, but Carson and Brock weren't ready to quit. Ignoring the warning once again, they looked for a way around. Soon they spotted a narrow ledge above the main trail. Maybe they could sneak past that way. The path was risky, slippery from layers of bat guano, and uneven. Carson was the first to climb up, carefully balancing while holding the flashlight in one hand. Brock followed close behind, each step riskier than the last. Below them was nothing but dark emptiness. Every move was a challenge. Every foothold felt like a small victory, but they kept going, convinced they were close to discovering a part of the cave few had ever seen. Around 10 p.m., while Carson was making his way along the ledge, his foot slipped on a loose rock. In a split second, he lost balance and plummeted about 40 feet straight down, crashing hard onto a pile of rocks. The impact echoed loud, shattering the cave's silence. Brock froze, the flashlight shaking in his hands. Down below, Carson lay motionless, surrounded by sharp stones and debris. The silence quickly turned into screams of pain. What started as an adventure had become a nightmare. Brock rushed down, desperate to reach his friend. When he found him, Carson was still conscious but barely able to speak. His face twisted in agony and was wet with tears. He was trapped under a pile of rocks. In a small pocket of air, Brock immediately began clearing the stones as fast as he could. Carson's body was battered, his arms, face, and torso covered in cuts and bruises, but what terrified Brock the most was how twisted and immobile Carson's legs were. Caught between the urge to get help and the fear of leaving his friend alone, Brock knew time was running out. Carson was trapped and partially buried. He started the trek back, trying to get out of the cave to find rescue. After hours of struggling, he finally emerged from the cave's darkness, completely exhausted and out of breath. At the visitor center, he found Park Ranger John McLaughlin and told him everything that had happened. McLaughlin immediately called a specialized rescue team, knowing every minute counted. In less than an hour, the team arrived with ropes, stretchers, and stabilization gear. Once they reached the accident site, they assessed the situation and began the rescue. Since any movement could make Carson's injuries worse, the first step was to immobilize him completely by securing him to a rigid stretcher, keeping his spine as stable as possible. The operation was carried out with the utmost care. Every move was calculated to avoid causing more pain or damage. The path back to the surface was tough, steep, slippery, and full of tricky turns that made carrying the stretcher a real challenge. The rescuers spoke quietly, alert to every obstacle. After hours of distress and hard work, the rescue team finally brought Carson out of the cave's darkness. Exhausted, injured, and aching all over, he was rushed straight to Guadalupe Medical Center, where doctors thoroughly examined his wounds. The news was heartbreaking. Carson had suffered a severe spinal cord injury that would leave him paralyzed from the waist down. It was a shock not just for him, but for his family, friends, and the whole park staff, who had never dealt with such a serious case before. This event sparked an important discussion about the dangers of reckless exploration, especially when mixed with alcohol and ignoring safety rules. Many experts in the caving community emphasize that caves are extremely hazardous environments for anyone lacking proper experience and equipment. Carson's tragedy served as a powerful warning to everyone. In response to the accident, the National Parks Management decided to tighten security even more. Stronger barricades were installed, warning signs made more visible, and patrols increased in restricted areas. On top of that, awareness campaigns were launched to educate visitors about the real dangers of caves and the importance of following the guidelines. This episode became a turning point in the park's history, a constant reminder of the heavy price that carelessness can demand. Even as time passes, the memory of that day stays alive. Carson and Brock were never the same. What began as a thrill-seeking adventure ended in a painful lesson for everyone involved. It was March 31st, 2012, in Weeki, Wachee Springs, Florida, a place known for its crystal-clear waters and vast underwater cave systems that attract divers from around the world. Among those divers was 29-year-old Marcin Ashley Kay, a seasoned cave diver with countless expeditions under his belt. He wasn't just experienced, he was a thrill seeker at heart, someone who found joy in challenges like skydiving, surfing, and of course, cave diving. Marcin also had a deep love for technology, working for 6 years in the IT department at Life South Community Blood Center. That day, Marcin was diving with the Karst Underwater Research Team, a group focused on mapping and exploring underwater caves. The day's plan was straightforward, a series of controlled dives to document the passageways and maintain diver safety in these extreme conditions. Confident and familiar with the terrain, Marcin was preparing for his final dive of the day. He took every precaution, double-checking his tanks, gear, and safety lines before descending into the depths of the cave system. The dive began without any issues. Marcin and his team followed the guideline, a vital rope that helps divers navigate back through the often disorienting tunnels. Moving in harmony, their flashlights cut through the silent blackness, highlighting the contours of the cave as they recorded new data. At depths exceeding 100 feet, the risks were constant. Divers must carefully monitor their pace to avoid nitrogen buildup in the blood, which can lead to decompression sickness. Marcin understood these risks well. Every move he made was deliberate and measured. As the team completed their tasks and began their ascent, Marcin remained calm and close to the line, methodically maneuvering through narrow corridors. But around 4:30 p.m., something changed. Near an exit section of the cave, Marcin suddenly broke away from the guideline. He swam toward a tight crevice, so narrow that even divers with side-mounted tanks would struggle to get through. His movements were rapid and erratic, a stark contrast to his usual precision. The other divers quickly noticed something was wrong and tried signaling with their dive lights, an underwater universal signal to stop. When that failed, they attempted tactile communication, lightly touching him to get his attention, but Marson's responses were scattered and frantic. He pushed further into the crevice, contorting his body to squeeze through the tight space. Panic began to spread among the team. Unknown to them, Marson was suffering from a cerebral arterial gas embolism. Rapid ascent is one of the greatest dangers in diving and a leading cause of life-threatening injuries. When a diver ascends too fast, nitrogen bubbles can form in the bloodstream, potentially blocking vital organs like the brain or lungs. In Marson's case, it's believed he suffered a cerebral embolism during ascent. This condition rapidly causes confusion, paralysis, and unconsciousness. It's a chilling reminder that no amount of experience can fully shield divers from the brutal consequences of physics and physiology. Marson's erratic behavior, his sudden and irrational decision to enter the crevice, was likely a result of his declining mental state. He was no longer thinking clearly, his actions growing more uncontrolled as the embolism progressed. Safety divers, stationed nearby with spare gas cylinders, watched helplessly as Marson wedged himself deeper into the crack. His movements had lost all coordination, and attempts to communicate continued to fail. Minutes passed. Eventually, his regulator was no longer in use, an ominous sign. The team feared the worst. Marson had likely lost consciousness. The situation was dire, and the tight walls of the crevice made reaching him nearly impossible. The team immediately alerted the surface crew, which had been standing by. Every second mattered, but underwater rescues are slow by necessity. Divers can't rush without endangering themselves. By the time a rescue diver reached Marson, it was too late. His body was unresponsive. His tank still held air, and his gear was functioning normally. The embolism had rendered him unconscious, and he eventually drowned, trapped inside the fissure. His body was brought to the surface just before 5 p.m. The recovery team was visibly shaken. They had done everything they could, but Marson had been lost in a matter of moments to something no one could have predicted or prevented. His mother once voiced concern about the risks, to which Marson replied, "Mom, if I die diving, at least I'll die doing something I love." That passion followed him to the end. After the incident, the Karst Underwater Research Team issued a statement acknowledging the unpredictable nature of gas embolisms and the importance of safety protocols. They stressed that Marson's decision to enter the crevice wasn't a conscious choice. It was a tragic consequence of his medical emergency. His final dive, though heartbreaking, underscored the immense respect demanded by the underwater world. It is a place of stunning beauty and relentless danger. It was the morning of August 2nd, 2004, and the vibe was nothing but excitement. That day's destination, Island Ford Cave nestled in rural Virginia. A 15-year-old girl, her name wasn't shared in any of the records, was all smiles. She could barely hold in her excitement as she buckled her helmet, switched on the headlamp, and listened closely to the safety instructions being given before the hike began. No one had the slightest clue how much that day was about to change. Island Ford Cave was pretty popular among local adventure seekers, especially fans of spelunking, which is just a fancy word for cave exploring. It was a go-to spot for youth camps in the area, known for having routes safe enough to bring teens into the rock formations without too much risk. The group was led by an experienced guide who had done this particular route countless times. That gave everyone some peace of mind as he led the group of 8 teens toward the wide, open mouth of the cave. As the group started making their way deeper inside, the hot summer air outside quickly faded away. The temperature dropped to a cool, almost chilly level, adding to the thrill of the whole experience. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They squeezed through narrow corridors that forced them to turn sideways just to get through, all while feeling that strange, exciting vibe of exploring a place where sunlight never reaches. This girl had been hyped for this cave trip since day 1 of camp, and she was being super cautious, carefully following all the warnings about loose rocks and slippery spots. Roughly 500 feet in, things got tighter and trickier. They reached a section where, long ago, the cave ceiling had partially collapsed. The result was a chaotic pile of boulders, cracks, and uneven ground, like a natural maze made of jagged rocks and makeshift steps. She was fourth in line, right behind the guide and two other campers. Her headlamp lit up just a few feet ahead, and every step had to be taken with care. Some rocks were solid and safe to step on, but others would shift with the slightest pressure. The guide kept pointing out the best spots to step on, calmly giving tips on which areas were most stable. Then came her turn. She stepped onto a rock that seemed solid enough, but the second she shifted her weight onto it, it moved. In just a few seconds, everything went wrong. She tried to catch her balance, arms flailing in the dark to grab something, anything, but it was too late. She slipped. And the fall wasn't a simple one. Her tumble ended with her wedged awkwardly between two massive rocks. But that wasn't the worst of it. The shift in weight and movement caused the already unstable rock pile around her to loosen even more. Stones of all sizes, some as small as her hand, others probably close to 20 pounds, broke free from the cave wall and came crashing down. She barely had time to cover her head before the first ones hit. When everything finally stopped moving, she was partially buried. A pile of rocks covered her torso and left arm. Her legs were stretched out and completely stuck. Her right leg, in particular, was tightly wedged between two massive rocks that wouldn't budge even under force. She tried to twist, pull her leg, shift her body. Nothing worked. Her leg was trapped from mid-shin to ankle in a super awkward and painful angle. The guide jumped into action. He made his way to her carefully and started removing the rocks on top of her. The other teens pitched in, helping to lift off the ones they could reach. The guide worked methodically, starting with the smaller stones on her torso. With each rock removed, she could breathe a bit easier, but her leg remained stuck, keeping the panic at full blast. He quickly realized this wasn't a simple rescue. Her leg had slipped into a narrow crack in such a way that her body didn't have the strength or angle to free itself. To make things worse, the fallen rocks had locked her into that position even more tightly. The guide tried everything. He tugged at the smaller rock, pinning her leg, but noticed it was part of a much larger formation, immovable without the proper tools. He dug around it, removed smaller stones, tried different angles, even used his own body to try to create leverage. Nothing worked. In fact, some attempts made the leg even more stuck. Meanwhile, the rest of the group stayed nearby. A few tried to comfort her, while others were frozen, unsure of what to do. The cave's temperature, which had felt refreshing earlier at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, now felt bone-chilling. Time dragged. What must have been 15 minutes felt like hours. Realizing they were out of options, the guide made the tough call. He told the assistant counselor to head back to the cave's entrance and get help as fast as she could. And then came the waiting. Every minute crawled by like an eternity. Above ground, the assistant ran to the nearest vehicle and grabbed the emergency phone. A specialized cave rescue team was contacted immediately. Within 20 minutes, volunteers from all over were loading gear and heading toward the site. These weren't your average emergency responders. These were trained pros who specialized in underground rescues. Inside the cave, the girl was stuck in a strange space between staying conscious and nearly blacking out. Almost an hour after her fall, they heard voices echoing through the darkness. Then came the flicker of headlamps bouncing off the cave walls. The assistant returned with 4 experienced rescuers, each carrying specific tools for the job. Their team leader quickly took over, assessed her condition, and examined exactly how her leg was pinned. With 3 members coordinating carefully, pulling at just the right angle, they finally managed to free her leg. The sense of relief was immediate. Now that she was loose, they could properly check her injuries. She had bruises all over her back and torso, but the worst was a deep gash on her left shoulder blade. It was bleeding heavily. They carefully placed her on a special stretcher, strapping her in tightly so she wouldn't move as they passed through the narrowest parts of the cave. Getting her out was slow and delicate. They passed the stretcher hand to hand through tight corridors until, at last, the soft glow of the evening sun came into view. A waiting ambulance had its doors open, ready to go. At the hospital, doctors ran every possible test. One of the biggest concerns was compartment syndrome, a serious condition where pressure builds up in the muscles and can cause permanent damage. There was also a risk of internal injuries, especially to her ribs, after being hit by those heavy rocks. Fortunately, the scans showed no fractures in her leg, but she did have 2 cracked ribs. With rest and proper treatment, she made a full recovery in the days that followed. On January 25, 1986, 4 cave explorers met up for an expedition they'd been planning for a long time. The cave, known as Parker's Pit, draws experienced cavers from all over the Midwest because of its technical challenges and deep vertical drops. This kind of cave requires advanced rappelling skills and specialized gear to even attempt safely. Unlike horizontal caves, where you can usually walk or crawl through, vertical caves like Parker's Pit demand precise rope handling and solid anchor setups just to survive the descent. That cold January morning, the 4 arrived at the entrance confident that they were fully prepped for the tough drop ahead. They were seasoned cavers, all with experience tackling vertical cave systems. But no amount of experience matters when basic safety protocols get ignored. As they geared up to drop into the depths, they came face to face with their first big challenge, a vertical descent called the Upper Bound, a 22-foot drop that requires serious rappelling skills to descend without injury. This first section was a very real threat. A fall from that height onto solid limestone could easily shatter bones, crush skulls, or snap a spine like a dry twig. 2 of the group members managed to make it down safely. Using the right technique and gear, they touched down at the bottom of the shaft and started getting ready to go deeper, having no idea the disaster that was about to unfold above them. The 3rd guy to descend made a critical, potentially fatal mistake when setting up his gear. He was using a bar brake system clipped to a carabiner, a common setup in caving that's used to control your speed while rappelling. When assembled properly, this setup allows for a smooth, controlled descent. But that only works if the rope is threaded exactly right through the system. It has to go through the carabiner, loop around the brake, and then back through the carabiner again. That final loop is what creates the friction needed to control the descent and stop freefall. Unfortunately, the 3rd team member completely missed that last crucial step. He ran the rope through the carabiner and brake, but forgot to bring it back through the carabiner one more time. That mistake turned the whole setup into a trap. The brake system lost all its stopping power and couldn't control his descent at all. The trap was set. Death was waiting 22 feet below on a limestone floor. The moment he leaned back to start the rappel, his incorrectly rigged system failed instantly. The rope flew through the brake with no resistance. He realized in sheer panic that he was falling, and fast. The walls of the shaft blurred past him, the rush of air roaring in his ears. Gravity took over, pulling him down at terrifying speed while the others watched in absolute horror. He hit the ground hard. His teammates rushed over, expecting to find a broken, lifeless body sprawled on the rocks. But what they saw made 0 sense. He was alive. He was actually moving. Against all odds, the guy had survived a fall that should have been 100% fatal. Shaky and stunned, he somehow stood up. No major injuries. It was nothing short of a miracle. But the psychological trauma hit instantly. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened set in. He had come face to face with death. And emotionally, he was a wreck. The smartest move at that point would have been to call it a day and head back to the surface. But in a wild, almost reckless decision, the group chose to keep going deeper into Parker's Pit instead of seeking medical help. The guy who had just survived the fall insisted he was fine and didn't want to abandon the plan. That mindset is one of the most dangerous things among explorers, the belief that surviving a near-death experience makes you invincible. So they continued, squeezing through narrow, hazardous passages, each step taking them further into the heart of the cave. Wading deeper inside was the most feared part of the entire system, a tight section known as the Z-Bend. It's a nightmare for any caver. A twisted series of passages so narrow they force you to twist and contort your body through spaces that barely seem humanly passable. The Z-Bend earned its reputation by trapping people in spots so tight they couldn't move forward or backward. The first one to try went in feet first, lying on his stomach. He wriggled his way to the first sharp turn and immediately warned the others just how tight it was. The second guy followed, also feet first but lying on his back. The second he entered the Z-Bend, he felt how brutally unforgiving that space was. The limestone walls pressed against him, making every movement a struggle. Breathing started to get harder. With his chest being compressed, each breath felt like a battle. It didn't take long before he realized he was completely stuck. The rock hugged him like a deadly vice, and panic set in fast. There was no way forward and no room to go back. Things got critical real quick. His chest was tightening, his breath shallow, and the panic only made things worse. The more he struggled, the more his muscles tensed up, which made his body expand and jam even tighter into the rock. The others heard him yelling for help. Time was running out. If they didn't get him out fast, the Z-Bend was going to claim a life. They jumped into action right away, but the tight space made every rescue attempt dangerous, not just for the guys stuck, but also for the ones trying to save him. One teammate got into position behind him, another ahead of him, both risking getting wedged in the same deadly trap. The rock wasn't giving them anything. Every move was blocked by the crushing limestone. The rescuers twisted themselves into awful angles, risking their own safety. Meanwhile, the trapped man's breathing was getting slower, more labored, his face was pale, and the signs of oxygen deprivation were clear. Inch by inch, they began to pull him out. Every little bit felt like a war with the cave. The rock scraped skin, tore clothes, made every second miserable. Finally, just as he was about to pass out, they yanked him clear of the tightest part of the Z-Bend. If that rescue had taken even a few more minutes, he wouldn't have made it. He would have died from exhaustion and suffocation. That harrowing extraction marked the end of what had become a full-on horror story inside Parker's Pit. 2 life-threatening incidents in one trip, it was a chain of terrifying events that very nearly ended in tragedy. The group began their long, difficult climb back to the surface, retracing the same paths that had almost killed them. The psychological toll of the day was written all over their faces. The excitement they'd started the morning with had been completely replaced by hollow stares, the looks of people who had stared death right in the face and somehow lived to talk about it. If you thought this story was wild, wait until you see the one popping up on your screen right now. It started off as a simple little adventure, just like this one, but the ending was way worse. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.